Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Talking ASEAN public webinar on regional defense cooperation amidst COVID-19 challenges and opportunities. The purpose of today's public webinar are to examine how COVID-19 has impacted defense cooperation agenda in the region, to examine how militaries are being involved in responding to the current COVID-19 pandemic in different countries in the region, and to explore the challenges and opportunities for military cooperation in the region in responding to the current COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So as we all know, the current COVID-19 pandemic has affected all facets of life, not only in terms of public health and the economy, but also in the area of defense cooperation. So whilst ASEAN has, at the beginning, had some success in trying to make a coordinated response, having called an urgent video conference of the ASEAN Center for Military Medicine, as well as issuing a joint statement amongst the ASEAN defense ministers. There hasn't been much follow-up since then. And at the same time, we've seen a number of regional military exercises seemingly to have been postponed or deferred as a result of the COVID-19. And these developments have raised a number of questions. How has COVID-19 impacted defense cooperation in the region? What roles do the militaries in the region play in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic? What will be the role of defense cooperation in increasing regional resilience to future health crises? And how should ASEAN respond to the COVID-19 pandemic be assessed in the context of comprehensive security approach? To answer these questions, I'm very delighted to be joined by three prominent experts with us today. We have Pak Frega Wenas Riwang, who is a lieutenant colonel in the Indonesian Army. He has worked as a lecturer at the Indonesian Defense University since 2013 and was a graduate of the Indonesian Military Academy, where he spent much of his career serving with the Indonesian Army Strategic Reserve Command, or COSTRAC. He is currently a PhD student at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We're also joined by Dr. Yandri Kurniawan, who will be joining us in a short while. He is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations at the University of Indonesia, and he is a lecturer and an editor-in-chief of Global Journal Politik International at the Department of International Relations, as well as a senior researcher and board of trustee member at the Abdul Rahman Wahid Center for Peace and Humanity. He is also a member of the editorial board and reviewer of several Indonesian international relations journals. He's also the author of The Politics of Securitization in Democratic Indonesia, published by Paragraph Macmillan, and a co-author of Strategic Culture and Indonesian Maritime Security. And last but not least, we also have Muhammad Arif, who is a researcher at the ASEAN Studies Program at the Habibie Center. So without taking too much time, I'd like to go straight into our first presenter, Pak Frega, for your presentation. So the floor is yours, Pak Frega.
All right. Thank you, Mas Ibrahim. Let me share my slide. Okay. All right. First, I would like to express my gratitude for Habibie Center for the invitation. And regarding the issue, I would like to discuss about the defense cooperation and COVID-19 from the perspective of defense diplomacy. Because currently, I'm working on a thesis on defense diplomacy. So basically, before I speak about defense cooperation, I would like to remind the audience about the definition of defense diplomacy. In the post-Cold War, we know that there has been an increasing use of armed forces as part of the foreign policy. And in 1998, Edmund and Mills mentioned about the use of armed forces in operation other than war. And they are used to achieve national and foreign policy objective abroad. And over time, there has been an evolving definition proposed by Andrew Coty and Anthony Foster in 2004, where they actually include the defense instrument, which to some extent comprise the Ministry of Defense as well, as part of the foreign and security policy tools. And regarding defense diplomacy, we are familiar with the presence of defense white papers. since the topic is about regional issues, I observed that most countries in the region have crafted or have formulated their defense white papers. For example, in the case of Indonesia in 2008 and 2015, these two white papers actually have articulated the urgency of defense diplomacy. Even in the recent one, we try to underline the role of defense attaché as the facilitator of defense diplomacy. And also the recent one white paper issued by the Malaysian Ministry of Defense, and also Vietnam last year, and also some partner countries in the region. So basically, if we are talking about defense cooperation, it is in line with the defense diplomacy, and mostly it is articulated in defense white paper. And regarding defense diplomacy, there are numerous activities actually, as identified by Coty and Forster. There are around 10 activities, and we have witnessed numerous events taking place. For example, like the context between strategic leaders, strategic military leaders, either bilaterally or multilaterally, because it's very common to use these two platforms, bilateral and multilateral, or even the military exercises, personnel exchanges, and even the recent one, it might include like the defense industry collaborations. And regarding the actors, in the beginning, it was managed by the official actors, which we also know as the track one, or official actors. And as we can actually see in a number of strategic consultation or strategic dialogues, like the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting or ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, where we know that the Minister of Defense and the military actually are the primary actors because of their expertise, and the sector is in defense and military. And in the context of ASEAN, not only the defense minister, but we also have the ASEAN Chief of Defense Forces informal meeting, but I believe that last year it has been formalized. So it's not an informal one anymore. And this is also under the ADMM, where actually the report of the activity organized by the SCDFM is also reported during the ADMM. And at the Chief of Services level, we also have the, I think, ASEAN Chief of Army multilateral meetings, and the Navy as well. We have ASEAN Navy Chief meeting, and the ASEAN Air Force Chief Conference. So basically the primary actors is the Ministry of Defense, the military, and the services. But there's also a supporting role played by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, because the leading actor in diplomacy is the foreign ministry. But in terms of defense cooperation and defense diplomacy, the military and defense ministry can play a significant role. And of course, track 2 is related with the non-official actors, as we may see that in recent years, there has been the increasing role as well, participation from the non-government organization, like think tank, research institute, and even in the context of ASEAN, we have network of ASEAN defense and security institution. And the track 1.5 is the combination of the two. We are also familiar with the Shangri-La dialogue. And in the past year, Indonesia is also organizing the Jakarta International Defense Dialogue. So how about the motive for defense diplomacy, or some extent defense cooperation? I identify actually 4 primary motives. First is the strategic engagement, because we noticed that we need to engage major powers. That is the reason why the ADMM has been extended to include the 8 strategic dialogue partners, and mostly our major powers country, like the US, China, and some of strategic partners like Russia as well in the club. And of course, our every country has their own strategic partners as well. So strategic engagement in terms of multilateral and as well as bilateral has been used as a motive to develop defense cooperation and defense diplomacy. And confidence building measure, of course, this is useful in strengthening the ties between countries, between military units, and even a simple thing for between people to people or a people to people connection, because to some extent, in a way to the deepening of defense or military ties between countries, especially in the region. We know that we share the same geography, quite a similar culture, even though different, nationality, and we have a common platform for over decades since the establishment of ASEAN. And the third motive is actually capacity building. Countries tend to organize cooperation with other countries in terms of building their military, modernize their military, because it's a common agenda, especially, even though countries tend to avoid conflict, but still we need to modernize our military, especially for the Indonesian case, where the country has suffered from embargo for over a decade. So it tried to catch up with those period, and part of the minimum essential forces, they try to catch up with the gap. And of course, defense industry, we know that under ASEAN as well, we have ASEAN Defense Industry Collaboration Network. And indeed, the last motive is for international reputation, be it for individual or be it for a group. For example, like ASEAN, we organize ASEAN Defense Minister meeting, and since 2010, it has been extended, include the 8 strategic dialogue partners. And I noticed that because of this prestige, some of the major countries have expressed their interest to join the group as well. Like some of the articles that I read, that like France and the United Kingdom have expressed their interest to join the club as well. So it's kind of support the international reputation, not only for individual but also for regional identity. And of course, in terms of individual, we can use this cooperation to promote the development of professional and modern military. And to some extent, because democracy has become a common value, maybe it can be used to promote democratic values as well, in terms of civil military relations, for example. And now I would like to touch upon defense cooperation. Duta actually defines defense cooperation as a tool. It's quite similar with defense diplomacy. So it is aimed to achieve foreign policy objective, and it can be done by established friendship with partner countries, either bilaterally or multilaterally. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, try to avoid conflicts. And the key consideration is to form a mutual trust between these participating countries or partners countries, and it is aimed to help enhance capacities as well. And of course, defense cooperation is an important aspect of defense diplomacy. That's why I try to present or try to deliver some earlier point on defense diplomacy. And as I mentioned, we can use defense cooperation to share operational and doctrinal expertise, because we know that at this stage, the country in the region, like Southeast Asia, we have different military platforms. So maybe we also have different experiences in dealing with military operation, especially, for example, like Indonesia. We've been participating in peacekeeping operation worldwide, and we have a significant number of peacekeepers on the ground at this stage. Maybe that could be an added value that we might share with other Southeast Asian countries. On the other hand, maybe like other militaries might share, because they have trained together with, let's say, like the US, the European, UK, or China and Russia. So this is also very important to enhance the capability, because if I'm not mistaken, that the ASEAN militaries have committed to collaborate, especially in dealing with the military operation other than war. As we remember, 2004, when Indonesia suffered from a tsunami in Aceh, there was a joint military operation in terms of humanitarian assistance. So in a way, it was a good start to work, but in a way, it is also there's also a challenge because of different platforms. Sometimes it doesn't match. That's why we need to have more interaction and engagement. And defense cooperation is also helpful in strengthening our defense relations or military ties. And also we can share best practices. And of course, interoperability is very critical if you are talking about military operation, be it military operation for war, or even the most important one, the most important for our region is actually military operation other than war, as we witness numerous issues regarding the security. And indeed, the information sharing as well is part of the defense cooperation. Sandy, Duran, and Hendricks mentioned about key consideration for defense cooperation. First point is the trust, confidence, and solidarity. Of course, there should be a trust because, in engaging with our partner, confidence because it helps to strengthen the relations between countries, and solidarity, especially for ASEAN, because over decades, we know that we have organized exercises either bilaterally, multilaterally, and it's interaction as well, personal exchanges. Sovereignty and autonomy can be a triggering point for a greater defense cooperations. Similarity of strategic cultures, as I pointed out earlier, this is very critical because over decades we have been interacting, so we might have a common, similar strategic cultures and geography and history as well. We are located in the same spot of the world, with the Southeast Asia region. Top down and bottom up, it means that all levels, be it strategic levels and the operational levels. So strategic defense leader at the ministry level, or chief of defense forces, and up to the boots on the ground, like the soldiers, the military units, between battalions. I remember years ago I was participating as part of the bilateral Indonesian, Singapore, and also with the Malaysian one, Kekar Malindo and Safar Indopura. And of course, standardization and interoperability is critical as well for defense cooperation. And I have identified 4 influence factors which drive the success of defense cooperation. The first consideration is the mutual interest. Doesn't matter whether it is bilateral defense cooperation or multilateral defense cooperation. We have to identify the mutual interest which will help us to nurture a greater engagement between countries or participating countries. Domestic factors, this is also critical as well, especially the domestic politics, because as we know that foreign relations is related with the parliament to some extent, especially if you want to establish a new relations with new partners. Role of military, this is also critical because they will be the boots on the ground. They will be the institution which will operationalize the policy at the operational level. Role of other actors, as we see in the prior slides, that there's been an increasing role of track 2 actors, which is not official. So the role like NGOs in nurturing, in helping, nurturing defense cooperation. Now it's getting more spot. I mean, in terms of, even though it's in terms of academic, but it can help to engage, because we also have like NADI, and even in terms of the academic institution we have under the ARF as well. So it is critical. And amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, I think I will try to focus on three defense cooperation activities, which is strategy consultations, and then the joint exercises and intermilitary assignments. Because the theme for this webinar series is actually about the challenges amidst the COVID-19. So as I pointed out earlier, we have both platform, bilateral and multilateral. Is very common when you are trying to engage through defense cooperation with other countries. So we have been dealing with this kind of stuff, strategy consultations. And as I mentioned earlier, we have at the ASEAN level, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting and ADMM Plus, and up to the service chief level. But because of the COVID-19, it is obvious that all this strategy consultation platform has been converted to virtual. And indeed, it's a good opportunity because we can sustain, but there's also challenges as well because the interaction is not as good as if we organize a face-to-face interaction. And also the event, the publication might not be as great as if we organize a real event. But the good thing is we can still sustain this one, even though it's through the virtual one. As you can see on the slide, there's a picture at senior official meeting at the Secretary General of Ministry of Defense. Recently, they organized that one, and they have committed as well. In the as mentioned by the moderator, that in February 2020, commitment of all the defense leader among ASEAN countries that they will try to share best practices and also practical concrete action regarding the effort to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second activity is actually joint exercises. This is actually it's a bit different from the prior one because strategic consultation mostly they are organized at the strategic levels. They involve the minister, chief of defense forces, chief of services. But this one, joint exercises at the operational level, where you can actually see a more concrete interaction between soldiers, between officers, between military units, and also bilateral and multilateral platform as well. Every year, annually, we have organized between ASEAN countries and also with other non-ASEAN countries and multilateral. We observed that Cobra Gold, it is organized in Thailand, but it invited some of the Southeast Asian countries and also the US. And Indonesia also host the multilateral naval exercise Komodo, but it seems because of the COVID-19, it has been suspended. And as mentioned earlier, the ASEAN Center of Military Medicine also organized a tabletop exercise last month, which is good. So basically, because of the impact of the pandemic, some of the exercises, most of the exercises actually have been canceled or suspended. But some has tried to approach a virtual mode like the ACMM. But maybe in the future, if we can develop like a virtual game that can actually connect soldiers or unit across region. I mean, in two different location, and they can simulate. But this can be a good opportunity, even though of course the security of the network will be a key considerations. And the third one is intermilitary assignments, because most of the Southeast Asian countries have been contributing in peacekeeping operation, and for the Indonesian case, we only consider intermilitary assignment to peacekeeping operation, I would probably discuss a bit about this one, because it is a good opportunity for Southeast Asian countries to contribute at the global level. Uh, in some missions, not only Indonesia but like Malaysia, in Lebanon, or some Singaporeans, Philippines, Thailand, or some other continents, we can actually interact and represent ASEAN. And not only we deal with the United Nations, but also with other contingents. Usually they organize like a sport events where we can interact. So in terms of the peacekeeping, there are numerous added value that we can do to support our defense cooperation. Because as I mentioned earlier, relations between military unit, between contingents in the peacekeeping mission, and personnel that they establish might be useful, for strengthening their military ties and defense ties, especially if those former peacekeepers they achieve higher rank or higher position. For example, like our past President Yudhoyono, he was a peacekeeper, and his connection, well, he used that connection, and it was useful as well when he tried to develop Indonesia's peacekeeping capability. And of course, in terms of peacekeeping operation, because of the COVID, the United Nations has set up new protocols. As you can see, that the patrol, they are wearing gloves, the mask as well, part of the procedures. So there's an impact on that one, but it has not stopped how we can actually develop our cooperations. And we have also witnessed numerous humanitarian assistance. In the case of Indonesia, even though we receive a medical supply, but we send our Air Force to facilitate the supply. It's part of the defense cooperation as well. And also sending a delegation to Australia to help put out the bushfire, and recently to Fiji, as part of the humanitarian assistance. This is good because the use of military or defense instrument as part of the foreign relations is very critical in terms of defense cooperations. And I would probably touch about this one as well, because it's very common, especially for Southeast Asian countries. The great powers rivalry has been there for years, and now we have witnessed an increasing great powers rivalry. And in dealing with this rivalry, there are numerous actually approaches which have been implemented by Southeast Asian countries. Like Coach already mentioned about limited alignment, where we tend to, to be close to one great power in one field, and then the other way, great power in different field, maybe in military to one great power, and then economic to one great power. And Evelyn Go also mentioned about the omni enmeshment, where actually Southeast Asian countries try to use ASEAN as a platform, a regional mechanism, as we have witnessed in the presence of ADMM and ADMM Plus, where we try to engage the strategic dialogue partners, including the United States and China, which have become the great powers. They have asserted their strategic influence in the region. And of course, pragmatic equidistant, as proposed by Laxmana. Every single country will have their national interests. This will drive them, but also the commitment collectively that we have under ASEAN framework to some extent might also drive how we actually develop our defense cooperation. And no taking aside, because ASEAN mostly are non-aligned countries, so we try to balance, maybe in terms of literature, academics might say, hedging, different terms, but the bottom line, we try not to take a side, especially for Indonesia. And opportunities amidst this pandemic, I see that we still have defense attaché, so it is good because As articulated in the recent white paper 2015, defense attaché is the facilitator of our defense diplomacy and defense cooperation. So, defense attaché can play a significant role in facilitating, even though some of the activity has been disrupted. And I noticed that we still have exchange military students at staff college and some courses, so which is good. The interaction is still there. Strategic commitment, as pointed out earlier at the last ACMM retreat, February 2020, all the strategic defense leaders that have committed to share best practices and try to tackle, the issue collectively. And the next point is virtual engagement. So even though there has been disruption, we can still use the virtual engagement to facilitate our interaction, be it bilaterally or multilaterally. For example, like the ASEAN Defense Senior Official Meeting, and perhaps the upcoming ADMM, ADMM Plus will use this scheme as well. And indeed, humanitarian assistance amidst this pandemic, it is still present. We can still use this one to engage with other militaries, with other defense instruments from other parts of countries in the region. And military medicine, because it's very related with the current health issue, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So the ASEAN Center of Military Medicine has tried to share best practices, as we have witnessed in the recent tabletop exercise. And they have been committed to share more along the way until maybe there's a cure for the COVID-19 disease. Challenges, of course, this is very critical, disruption on various activities, as I pointed out earlier, like strategic consultation, joint exercises, and many other activities. Of course, it has created significant impact in terms of quantity and, of course, in quality as well, because there's no vivid, live face-to-face interaction. And of course, because of the disruption, there's a limitation on the number of interaction between military units, military personnel, as we have witnessed through all the defense cooperation activities, particularly in joint exercises, because the bonding usually will be established if you meet personally, and then you work together on the ground, where you can actually, build a common feeling that will be very useful to maintain your personal relation with your peers from other countries. And indeed, because most of this interaction has been converted virtually, so there's a challenge on the network security, because this is a critical issue, as we know that, I think in the last few weeks before, we heard about the insecurity of Zoom. So many institutions try to avoid using Zoom, but in a way, maybe ASEAN has a way to secure the connection, like a direct interaction network, which will be useful, of course. And indeed, defense budget reduction, as we know that most countries in the world have suffered, especially in the region. Some of the Southeast Asian countries, or most of the South Asian countries, have to reallocate their defense budget to focus on helping the government to deal with the COVID-19. And indeed, there will be impact as well based on this adjustment. And as I mentioned earlier, intensifying great powers referee is very critical, especially as we have witnessed the recent regional dynamic. And of course, as a region, as part of ASEAN, we try to leverage our defense cooperation, not only in dealing with our domestic issues, but regional issues, and maybe also with this kind of dynamic. And these are the references, and I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I give it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frege, for the very comprehensive presentation on defense cooperation and COVID-19. I particularly like the parts about the opportunities and challenges that we now face. Um, so we now turn to our next speaker, Pak Yandri Kurniawan, who I think is with us now. Pak Yandri, are you there?
Yes,
Yes.
finally here.
Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to pass the floor to Pak Yandri. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Could anyone help me to show the presentation slide, please?
Sure, we'll get our team to do that. Yes, it's on now.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to apologize for the inconvenience for the joining the webinar. Technical problems with my laptop. Out of nowhere, it's suddenly updating now, and still updating. And secondly, I would like to thank the Habibie Center for inviting me to join this webinar. In this talk, I would like to propose an idea that I do think that this COVID-19 or pandemics disease in general is a renewed opportunity for ASEAN practical defense cooperation. And I intentionally put the word practical in this title. So first, because of nothing new about pandemics. So I've been looking to literatures on security, health security and pandemic disease and health infectious disease. And from my from what I found so far, I think it's not really, there's nothing new actually about the pandemic disease. And because this pandemic disease is not really new in international affairs in general, and as well as in ASEAN, regionally speaking. So that's why I put the word renew opportunity on the topic. So the next slide, I would like to sorry, the outline slide, please. So this is the outline of my presentation. First, I would like to present like a quick look on pandemic, both in the regional and regional level. And then in the second section, I would like to overview ASEAN existing cooperation on defense, disaster, and health. And lastly, I would like to propose some idea about how COVID-19 could be a possible defense cooperation for ASEAN. So basically what I'm doing here is totally intellectual exercise and very subjective in a sense. So it's really open for debate and suggestion and further discussion about this. Next slide, please. And the first section, I would like to say basically that from what I've read through the literatures on pandemic at the global and regional level, I would, against the conventional wisdom, I try to posit an argument here that basically pandemic is not new to humankind, and basically the world had prepared for it at least since 100 years, and COVID-19 proves that whatever we've done before failed. Next slide, please. So this is the basic outlines, basic data in very brief. The pandemic disease since the Black Death 100 years ago, more than half millenniums ago. So since the Black Death until COVID-19, one thing that we can underline here that a major pandemics happens every 100 years. So maybe not too scientific to make this generalization, but at least our data shows in that way. So exactly 100 years ago, we have a Spanish flu. A Spanish flu happened in Europe and the surrounding area. But if we look at the history in Javanese islands, in particular, we know exactly that the Javanese and Indonesian or East Indies at the time also suffer from the Spanish flu. It took around 4 to 5 million lives in Java Island alone back then. Roughly 100 years before that, we have cholera, and 100 years before that, we have the Great Plague of Marseille, and before that, we have an Italian plague. So Italian plague took like 1 million lives, cholera like more than 1 million lives, then Spanish flu, the infamous Spanish flu, around 40 to 50 millions. Now we have like roughly 300,000 lives because of COVID-19. So this data shows that basically pandemic disease is always been there, live together with the human being. And so this is one proof that I can show that to support my argument that pandemic disease is not new for the human, for us, human beings. Next slide, please. And this slide shows that since Spanish flu, there was a change how people concerned about the influenza or pandemic disease before and after the Spanish flu. So before the Spanish flu, pandemic disease was not perceived as security issues. It was perceived basically as some situation, unpleasant situation. It's only a nuisance. It was not threat as a public security issues. It was not perceived as a disaster. But since the Spanish flu in early 20th centuries, the health problem had been framed as a security threat due to its morbidity and mortality and how it affects on economic and social stability. And then since right after the World War II, there was an interim committee charged with the overseeing the creation of new Universal Health Organization, which became WHO. And this organization has been creating influenza research and other pandemics, infectious disease since then. And then also what happened in 50s, we can show that medical professionals adopted security-related terminology. They used the word threat. They put a label of threat to the pandemic health problem to describe the danger posed by the pandemic influenza. And then, since then, like research center laboratories joined WHO, and we have global influenza surveillance network. And then in late 20th century, since 1997, we have a renewed concern about this infectious disease, H5N1, 2003 SARS, 2000 avian and swine flu, which providing a new context for the new urgency. For example, in 1997, the U.S. Department of Defense established a military-operated global laboratory based on influenza surveillance program. And also in 1998, we have global emerging infection surveillance and response system. And then one very interesting quote that I found from the literature that mentions that the Western government, since the 2000, Western government launched initiative aimed at developing and testing national pandemic influenza. Plans were developed using scenarios supported by epidemic modeling and clinical attack, often based on 1918 pandemics to predict the extent of the projected human mortality. So basically, that's why I argue that basically the words, government in general, globally speaking, had prepared to this situation, this COVID-19. But somehow, yeah, where we have here, like every country seems to me lost their grips, and that's happened in Asia, it's happened in the United States, it happens in Europe, and mostly in every part of the world. And also some literatures also show us like how the fundings that they've been collected to enhance global pandemic preparedness. And next slide, please. Regionally speaking, ASEAN has been prepared for this health problem regionally. So since the outbreak of 1997 avian flu, the ASEAN has been the box that I frame in the red lines there. It shows that since early 2000, post-SARS era at the time, ASEAN have been dealing with this emerging infectious disease. Then also had prepared something to deal with national multi-sectoral pandemic preparedness and response since 2007 and 2010. Next slide, please. But yet here we are today. So regardless what has been done in the last 20, 30 years, let's say since 1997, or maybe if they trace back really long time to Spanish flu, so it seems like what the world has prepared in 100 years, or at least in the last 20 years, proves disappointed. So, quoting Amitav Acharya here, he said that many countries have been grossly unprepared. The quarantine system invented by the 6th Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid in early 18th century AD seems to be the only effective way to combat the spread of the virus, aside from fashionable post-modern terms, social distancing and whatsoever. So it seems to me like the way we deal with the COVID-19 as the very recent pandemic disease did not, we haven't moved from 1,200 years ago. So basically quarantine, put social distancing. If there is an outbreak in one place, better not to go there, and people from that place should not go out from that place. So nothing changed in the last 1,200 years, despite the whole effort that has been done since Spanish flu, and also especially renewed since 1997. Also, regardless what has been done regionally within ASEAN framework. Next slide, please. And in the second section, I would like to overview the ASEAN Existing Cooperation on Defense, Disaster, and Health. So in short, I would like to argue here that this cooperation across these sectors basically lack of interaction, or maybe lack of communication from one sector to another. And here we have a structure of ASEAN Defense Cooperation. So under the ASEAN Political Security Community, we have ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus and ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting. And then under the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting, we have a various cooperation mechanism there. So we have like ASEAN Defense Senior Official Meeting Working Group. We have ASEAN Chief of Defense Forces Informal Meeting. We have ASEAN Chief of Army Multilateral Meeting. We have ASEAN Force Chief Conference. We have ASEAN Navy Chief Meeting. We have ASEAN Military Operational Informal Meeting. We have ASEAN Military Intelligence Informal Meeting. We have ASEAN Surgeon Major Annual Meeting. We have ASEAN Armies Rebel Meet, and so many mechanisms within ASEAN Defense minister meeting. Next slide, please. And this slide shows that sectors of ASEAN defense cooperation. So basically, there are 9 sectors where ASEAN have been cooperating. ASEAN member states have been cooperating to each other, and at least I highlight 5 sectors that could be directly linked to the effort how to deal with the spread of infectious disease here. For example, ASEAN military assess the capacity in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. ADMM, ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Logistics Support Framework. And also we have direct communication links. We have ASEAN Militaries Ready Group on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And also we have ASEAN Center of Military Medicines. Next slide, please. And the second sector here, we have a ASEAN cooperation on disaster management. So this is what I found interesting. ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting, has been held under the pillar of ASEAN political security community. Now, in the second sector of cooperation on disaster management, this has been held under the ASEAN ASEAN socio-cultural community. So under this pillar, we have ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Disaster Management. We have ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management and ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, like AHA Center. Next slide, please. The next slide shows us that ASEAN also have cooperation on health sectors. Again, the cooperation under health sectors has been held under the pillar of ASEAN socio-cultural community. Under this pillar, we have ASEAN Health Cooperation, Governance, and Implementation. And then we have two branch of this AHCGI, ASEAN Health Minister Meeting, and Senior Officials Meeting on Health and Development. And there are 4 clusters under this ASEAN Health Cooperation, Governance, and Implementation, promoting health lifestyle, strengthening health system and access to care, and ensuring food safety. But the second cluster is very related to the disaster management and the spread of infectious disease. It says that responding to all hazard and emerging threat. And then the ASEAN Secretariat in 2018 published this ASEAN Post-1915 Health Development Agenda. So from time period is 2016-2020. Nevertheless, the copyright is 2018. This agenda explicitly mentioned the word disaster in it, but interestingly, it doesn't say anything about ASEAN Committee for Disaster Management and ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance. It doesn't say anything about military. It doesn't say anything about defense. But if we look back to the slide number 10 especially, the ASEAN Defense Cooperation explicitly have cooperation on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. ASEAN has militaries ready group on human rights assistance and disaster relief. Even ASEAN have since 2015 ASEAN Center of Military Medicine. So go to the slide 13, please. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so from these 3 sectors, we can have a temporary or early conclusion that, or at least early finding that, there are 3 sectors within ASEAN cooperation that involve in this defense cooperation, disaster, and health issues. First, military official and professionals. Second, humanitarian and disaster official and professionals. And the last one is health official and professional. But to conclude, or maybe to express the relation between these three official and professional, maybe nothing best to capture that than Guns N' Roses songs in 1991. What we've got here is failure to communicate. How come an agenda literally mentioned about disaster, but it doesn't mention anything about the military cooperation within ASEAN, which actually have cooperation on the Force Ready Group, and also the Center for military medicine, something that we really need, ASEAN really need, the member states really need during this unprecedented emergency. So, based on those early findings, I would like to move to the last section of my presentation. How, next slide please, how COVID-19 create a new or renewed possibility or opportunity for ASEAN defense cooperation. We have all reason, because pandemic is nothing new to humankind. So we have all reason for the new cooperation, defense cooperation. So next slide, please. So theoretically speaking, the military could be used to deal with non-military issues. So theoretically speaking, we have four typical military functions, from combat function, combat support function, service support function, and non-military function. Next slide, please. So if we take out of those missions from four military function, then we can see that from combat support function, the military has an intelligent capabilities, communication capabilities, psychological operation, search and rescue. From service and support function, there's a sea lift, air lift, logistic, and civil affairs. From non-military function, we have humanitarian assistance capacity, we have disaster relief operation, we have civic work that very common to be done by military service all universally in international standards. So within this, from these capacities, from different function, military function, the military has been planning and make a preparation to deal with infectious disease. Military has been conducting surveillance for influenza and other form of infectious disease. The military facilities, military research centers, in cooperation with civilian expertise and professional, have been conducting research. And the military, of course, has a capacity to respond to the situation and conduct the mitigation. So basically, military have many capabilities applicable to global health, ranging from research, surveillance, and medical expertise to rapidly deployable large-scale assets for logistic, transportation, and security. And next slide, please. And here in this slide, I tried to provide how the military have been conducting activity to deal with the health and pandemic disease right the way since the end of World War II. So since 1949, the U.S. Army have since 1949, the U.S. Army and Navy has operated 20 overseas laboratories all over the world. Even China, PLA, China's military, has deployed medical units throughout Africa on mission targeting malaria and HIV/AIDS. The French Army has, the French Armed Forces has been the similar activity in Africa. And then even ASEAN Center for Medicines, Military Medicine, originally established from the cooperation within Thai governments and Russian. They've been co-chair this expert working group on military medicines from 2014 and to 2016. And from that co-chair working group, now we have ASEAN Center for Military Medicine. So military involvement in health and pandemic disease also is not new for international political activities. Next slide, please. So within the ASEAN mechanism, so this is maybe probably some points that I can propose in very general way of speaking, how the ASEAN could have a defense cooperation in dealing with pandemic disease. First, maybe the ASEAN could develop a specific forum in which militaries of ASEAN member states and other regional head actors can interface effectively. And the second one is ASEAN could develop and implement regional military policy and doctrine on humanitarian assistance, disaster management in collaboration with civilian counterparts. And the next point would be the support joint exercise and training activities between military and civilian agencies. The fourth point would be the increased ASEAN engagement in planning, implementation effort related to infectious disease, prevention, detection, and response through the ASEAN Health Security Agenda. So basically what I'm trying to say here, I think it will be very useful if ASEAN have a forum where the militaries of ASEAN member states can meet together and in collaboration with the civilian health professional and actors, then they could develop some kind of war gaming scenario against the pandemic disease. So if maybe in the future, these ASEAN militaries can work together to make us the war scenario, how the pandemic disease could spread out in the region, and then have the contingency plans and how they know how to mitigate it. So we will have like a ASEAN standing force to deal with the pandemic disease. Why? Because the pandemic disease has been there. It's been there around us since the very early days of human civilization. And I believe the pandemic disease, this infectious disease, will stay with us till the end of time. So let's not hope this pandemic disease will disappear somehow or just simply evaporating, but it's better to prepare ourselves through any possible mechanism. And if we have another outbreak in the future, we know how to deal with it. At least we have planned how to deal with it, instead of we still living in the era of Umayyad Khalid in 1,200 years ago. And next slide, please. So this is my very subjective idea. So basically, we have 7 sectors. We have like existing mechanism, cooperation mechanism on defense matter, on disaster relief, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also for the health issue. We have ASEAN military assets and capacities, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We have ADMM logistic support framework. We have direct communication link. We have ASEAN military ready group on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We also have ASEAN Center for Military Medicine. We have ASEAN coordinating center for humanitarian assistance and disaster management, we also have ASEAN Health Cooperation Governance and Implementation. Maybe we should try to put all of this mechanism, cooperation mechanism, in one one system, or whatever we like to call it. So this cooperation should be in my very rough idea, this cooperation, this mechanism should be under ASEAN Defense Minister meeting, ASEAN Minister on disaster, ASEAN Minister meeting on disaster management, and ASEAN Health Minister meeting. And then we have the AHA Center there, and maybe we should have this kind of bicameral center under the under AHA. One center develop capacity for natural disaster, and the other side of the center develop capacity on pandemic disease. Because what I believe, since we live in the Southeast Asia region, we cannot avoid these two problems. Non-traditional security problem, we have a problem of natural disaster, we have a problem with the pandemic disease. This problem, these two problems, has been there for very, very long time, and I believe it will stay there for till the end of time. And then under this center, we can coordinate, or collaborate, or whatever terms we would like to use. We can put there the HADR. We have a logistic support facility. We can put direct communication link, and so on and so forth. And the best part of this cooperation, this defense cooperation on disaster, natural disaster, and pandemic disease, because the nature of this problem is often seen as neutral, so such activities can be feasible when the relationship building is difficult by other means. And under ADMM mechanism, they try to push the ASEAN military and defense cooperation for the practical cooperation, so not at the strategic level, but more on the practical. So it will have less implication for the sovereignty sensitiveness and these high-level political issues. Next slide, please. And so, since ASEAN really into adopting and creating new norms, I think this also in line with what ASEAN has been done so far. So universally speaking, there are at least 3 international norms: Oslo guidelines on the use of foreign military and civil defense assets in disaster relief, international norms. We also have international norm on civil military guidelines and reference for complex emergencies, or also known as military and civil defense assets. And also we have a UN Global Health Cluster paper on civil military coordination during humanitarian health action. So we can adopt these existing international norms into a new, probably new or strengthen the existing norm in ASEAN. So we will have a possible proposed ASEAN norms based on the existing international norm. We can have like ASEAN guidelines on the use of foreign military and civil defense asset for pandemic disease. We can have ASEAN civil military guidelines and reference for complex emergencies. Also ASEAN regional health cluster paper on civil military coordination during humanitarian health actions. So next slide, please. So basically what I'm trying to say here is to, in line with this ASEAN tagline, one ASEAN, one response. So let's become one community during this pandemic era and really create ASEAN as one community, and we know how to respond to the problem as a one community. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much, and apologize for technical problems here and there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanji, for the very interesting presentation on pandemic disease, a renewed opportunity for ASEAN practical defense cooperation. I thought it was worth highlighting your point how the military and health and disaster management officials in ASEAN don't seem to be under the same pillar, and I think that's something that's worth following up on. And I particularly enjoyed the practical recommendations that you offered, including having maybe a specific forum for those defense and health officials to sit together and to try and overcome the current pandemic disease. Before moving to our last speaker, I'd like to just encourage to all our audience on YouTube, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the live chat feature to ask any questions you might have for our three speakers for our Q&A session later on. So without further ado, I'd like to move to our last speaker, to Muhammad Arif. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Mas Yandri, Mas Frega. Always a good thing about being last speaker is most of the fields have been covered by the previous speaker. So I hope I can be quick. But you know, whenever a speaker says it's going to be quick, it's going to be anything but quick. Can I have the presentation, please? Right. So basically, the case that I want to make today is that defense cooperation in ASEAN, military cooperation in ASEAN is inherently difficult, and it has something to do with the how ASEAN was established, why ASEAN was established, the threat perception of the ASEAN member states, and how it has been developing from time to time. But at the same time, it can be a good news as far as the ASEAN response to COVID-19 is concerned. Next, please. So that particular argument is based on two conceptual observations, so to say. First is that ASEAN has never really been comfortable with the idea of defense cooperation, military cooperation, you know, a full-scale, full-fledged military cooperation, you know, the one that involves combat exercises or, you know, something that is more traditional in a sense. Defense cooperation in ASEAN has been, you know, more, as Mas Yandri said before, more practical oriented. It aims to increase interaction, build trust and confidence, and so on and so forth. That's the first thing. Second thing is that ASEAN has never really securitized health. So health security in ASEAN is not a security issue. It's still a public, largely still public health concern. So disease is not, although it falls under the purview of under the category of transnational challenges, it's never been on the same page with some other transnational challenges, particularly terrorism or even trafficking or maritime security, for example. It's never been on the same category as that transnational challenges. So you have these two tendencies in ASEAN, that ASEAN is not comfortable with a full-fledged military cooperation, and ASEAN has never really securitized health issues. When you combine these two, you have a regional institution that cannot really live up to its full potentials in trying to respond to this current COVID-19 crisis. But I think that doesn't have to be that way. That ASEAN really has a lot of existing infrastructures that it can leverage on you know, trying to respond to this current COVID-19 crisis, especially on its infrastructure on HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation, which is very robust infrastructure, even if you compare it with other regional other initiatives in other parts of the world. Next. So ASEAN, as we know it, is an aspiring security community, but not really in a sense that was officiated in 2015. But also it's it's been aspiring to be a security community since the very beginning, since it was established in 1967. And of course, the security community, as we know it, is a group of states that are really close to each other, that use of force is ruled out as a means to solve dispute. So what ASEAN has been trying to do is to promote the so-called long-term habit of cooperation. And this has something to do with the political context, the strategic context during which ASEAN was established. We had confrontasi and Malaysia having tension with the Philippines. So the objective was not really to have an alliance against an external enemy, but really in trying to eliminate the chances for conflicts between ASEAN member states. And in that particular context, defense cooperation, in which the defense cooperation in traditional sense, in which you have a military alliance or a pact against a particular enemy outside, is not really relevant with ASEAN. But it's not like it's never been tried. There's this very famous article by Amita Acharya in 1991, which records how different notions about defense cooperation really was raised in different times during ASEAN's development. In 1976, for example, there was a notion about establishing a joint defense council in ASEAN. There was a notion about defense community in 1989, a notion about joint command, and so on and so forth. But none of this notion really gained traction or gained momentum. And the fact that none of this notion really gained momentum, I think, shows that how ASEAN is really shy about, really cautious about, shift their security cooperation approach into something that is more traditional, in the sense that defense cooperation, military alliance, and so on and so forth. So there is the as we know it, there's a preference for bilateralisms, like in the case of U.S. and Philippines alliance, or Singapore and U.S. defense cooperation, or more recently cooperation at the sub-regional level, as we see in the Strait of Malacca, for example, the cooperation between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and later Thailand, or in the Sulu Sea between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. But as far as defense cooperation within the framework of ASEAN, I think it's been purposely oriented towards trust and confidence and non-traditional security issues. While extra ASEAN cooperation, the one that engages other external powers, aim more towards engaging the external powers, the major powers, and socialize norms to them, trying to change their behavior. There's always been this realization, right, that Southeast Asia cannot escape from great powers rivalry. So the best that ASEAN can do is to try to engage these great powers and make their interaction as peaceful as possible in ASEAN's favor. So here we have norms or initiatives, the ZOPFAN, the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or initiatives regarding confidence building measures in ARF, or even the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, you name it. All of these documents or these initiatives aim towards engaging the external powers rather than naming a particular actor or particular issue out there as the common threat or common strategic interest of ASEAN member states. Next. This tendency of ASEAN to be shy about full-fledged defense cooperation, of course, is best shown by the case of ADMM, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, and by extension, the ADMM Plus is the the primary so-called consultation forum on defense issues in ASEAN. And since the very beginning of the establishment of ADMM in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, it was clearly stated that the aim is to mostly address non-traditional security challenges. But the interesting thing about ADMM and ADMM Plus is that it has gone further than, I would say, any other ASEAN-led or ASEAN Center security cooperation initiatives, even ARF. And it's interesting because in the concept paper that on the establishment of ADMM in 2006, it was said that ADMM should complement other ASEAN-led forums, including but not limited to ARF. But interesting that ADMM and ADMM Plus has gone further than ARF, which many have criticized for having too sluggish and too lethargic and not moving anywhere. And part of this owes to also touched by Mas Yandri before, the deliberate choice to focus more on practical cooperation, areas of cooperation that can be comfortable for all of the parties involved. We don't hope, at least soon, to see ADMM discussing specifically about South China Sea, for example, because that's something that might trigger tension in the room. So it focuses more on the so-called low-hanging fruits. Next. Second thing is about the securitization of diseases. Again, securitization, of course, is the process in which an actor declares a particular issue to be an existential threat to a specific referent object through a speech act. So you elevate the status of a particular issue from a non-security issue into a security issue, and the securitization of transnational challenges is required to make it a security threat, because by default, transnational challenges are not normally a security issues. States being conservative, focusing more on territorial integrity, sovereignty against military threats, and so on and so forth. So transnational challenges by default do not really fall under that rubric of security threat. So you need to elevate the transnational challenges to become a security threat. You need speech act. You need to securitize these transnational security challenges. But the thing with ASEAN is that even when all ASEAN member states agree to talk about transnational security issues, there's no so-called coherent ASEAN discourse on such issues. So we know the notion about transnational security challenges really started to take off in 1990s. But since then, we've heard a lot about transnational challenges or transnational transboundary challenges, which I think really is only about haze, the transboundary challenges. However, while other issues such as communicable disease, piracy, and other so-called transnational challenges really fall under what ASEAN called as transnational crime. So you have these different names or different wordings in addressing this the same thing. And of course, there's an issue of terrorism, and I said terrorism in ASEAN is largely treated in a distinct category than other transnational challenges because of the scale or the magnitude of the perceived magnitude of the problem, and it has something to do with war on terror and later ISIS and how it drives ASEAN response to terrorism. Next, please. So in ASEAN, there's still this narrow approach in looking at health and security, looking at how disease can be used as offensive weapons. And here we see the discussion about the CBR, the CBR threat, the chemical, biological, and radiological weapons, and how it can be used by non-state actors, terrorists. So health or disease in ASEAN is largely still treated as a byproduct as far as security discussion is concerned. Of course, health is treated as a byproduct of the existing threat, namely terrorism. So you link this new thing to the existing conception of threat that's already been there. And of course, as I said, this has something to do with how great powers think about it. If not for anthrax in 2001, for example, and if not for war on terror since 2001, I think the discussion about chemical, biological, and radiological weapons in ASEAN might not have been this loud. So when it comes to COVID-19, we know that securitization is clearly taking place at the individual level states, right? The indicators are quite clear. When you securitize an issue, you allocate more resources into the handling of that particular issue. You draft a specific legislation. You institutionalize your responses. You establish task forces and so on and so forth. You involve military. I think this is one of the clearest example, the clearest sign of a securitized issues, right? But collective securitization at the regional level, at the ASEAN level, has been largely absent. There is no new there's what authors call new vocabularies or new set of priorities when it comes to dealing with COVID-19. The handling of the COVID-19 at the regional level arguably is still done within the framework of normal politics, within the existing framework of ASEAN itself. And of course, as also mentioned by previous speakers, diseases in ASEAN has been largely fall under the purview of ASEAN socio-cultural community pillar. And given the context of ASEAN, in which cross-pillar discussion is not always been easy, this might be a problem as far as the agenda to securitizing disease is concerned. So again, in ASEAN, health security is not a security issue; it's still a public health issue. Next, please. And these different framings of how ASEAN think about health security, I think we can see it from how ASEAN leaders talk about it, how ASEAN leaders frame about it. And this is from a number of declarations made within the context of ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. Of course, the ADMM is not the only forum in which ASEAN talk about COVID-19 or security cooperation in general. But of course, this is a primary forum. So I think it can at least show the general picture of how ASEAN think about transnational security and disease in particular. So we can see since the very beginning, 2007, when ADMM was just established, there was a clear statement that the commitment to build trust and confidence would be the main task of, or the main goal of ADMM. No specific mention of disease whatsoever. In 2014, there was a mention of natural disaster, but not really on infectious disease. But we can compare it, and we can compare this to how ADMM and ASEAN in general frames terrorism. In 2014 declaration, for example, the Islamic State was clearly framed as a threat to all regions in the world. In one of the declaration in 2018, terrorism is called as a severe threat to ASEAN's progress, prosperity, and the very way of life, which I think in the context of academic discussion of securitization is one of the, the clearest languages you can use to identify some issues of security issues. In 2019, again, there's confusion about, the term ASEAN uses when it comes to addressing transnational security issues. And only in 2020, in February, that ADMM organized a special meeting to address the issue of COVID-19. But again, the framing of COVID-19 as a threat is largely absent in that particular meeting. Next, please. So what are we expecting ahead? I think, first of all, as Southeast Asia is and will remain a disaster-prone region, and both natural and man-made. And in this particular context, regional response capacity is urgently needed. And secondly, COVID-19 is global in scale. It affects almost all countries in the world. And from our experience, we know that when great powers are affected by certain transnational issues, chances are securitization for that particular issues would be easier. We see it in the case of anthrax, SARS, and then Ebola. Only when great powers are affected, then they can act as the supporters or entrepreneurs of the norms socialization. Third, again, the shyness of ASEAN to involve in a full-fledged military cooperation, the deliberate choice to be practical in ADMM and other security cooperation initiatives in ASEAN would mean that, as Mas Yandri said before, securitization of diseases would face little resistance because it is an issue that might be in the common interest of all parties involved, including the external powers. And then I think this is what I think is quite important, is that ASEAN can really leverage on the existing infrastructure that it already has, especially in the areas of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which is relatively very robust infrastructure, even if you compare it with the European Union and other regional institutions. We have the agreement on disaster management and emergency response, which was adopted in 2005 and implemented by the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on disaster management. Is a very progressive document, very comprehensive document, and is legally binding. In the context of ASEAN, it's very, when you have a document that is legally binding, chances are it's a good news, right, for ASEAN. It's an underrated document, I would say. And the ACMR calls upon each party, amongst others, to commit their military, to earmark, to identify their military assets that can be used for regional standby, the so-called regional standby arrangements. So there's already this notion to involve the military in the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It just so happens that, I think it's not unique to ASEAN. The HADR missions tend to focus more on the natural disasters kind of operations, right? So while providing assistance in the cases of disease crisis caused by disease is not really the main idea of HADR. There is the SASOP, the Standard Operating Procedure for Regional Standby Arrangement, and the coordination of joint disaster relief and emergency response operation. The most interesting thing, I think, there's always there is already the development to establish the ASEAN militaries ready group on HADR. It would be a very progressive development in which ASEAN can have a standing quote unquote standing force that would be ready to be deployed to any part of the region whenever a disaster happens. So as one of the scholars said, is amongst world's best practice, and I think this is an infrastructure that ASEAN can leverage as far as its response to COVID-19 is concerned. But of course, there's also challenges when it comes to HADR. We can see how recently HADR missions and platforms, military platforms used for HADR, often serve a dual function. So warships that you call as providing HADR support, this the very same warship you can use for combat missions, of course. And also in terms of policies, we can see how countries sometimes try to use the title or the title of HADR missions to to promote their geostrategic interests. So I think this duality of HADR in the long term might be a problem, but in the short term, for ASEAN collective response to COVID-19, the HADR infrastructure, I think, is a very interesting leverage that ASEAN can use. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arif, for the presentation highlighting why cooperation in ASEAN is difficult and why that could actually be a good thing. So we now turn to our Q&A session. We have about 6 questions by our audience. So I'll read them one by one, and we'll hand it over to our speakers to address. So the first question is from Mr. Sigit Suryo Nugroho from RSIS NTU, who asks, given that ASEAN has enacted such robust cooperation, why has ASEAN seemed to underperform during the early phase of COVID-19? Or is this just an issue of us failing to notice their performance? From Abid Adonis from the Paris School of International Affairs and Science, do you think that the current ASEAN stuttering in dealing with COVID-19 also stems from a lack of leadership in ASEAN? The third question is from Harry David from the Korean Mission to ASEAN, who asks, what effort should ASEAN undertake to optimize the ASEAN Center for Military Medicine in responding to COVID-19? And how do you see or perceive the potential cooperation between the ACMM and ASEAN's external partner? We also have a question from Marina from the Habibie Center, who asks a specific question to Pak Frege. Is there an alternative or innovation in implementing defense cooperation amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, especially at the operational level? And a question from Galbi, who is an expert staff in the Indonesian Parliament, who asked a question to Pak Yandri. And his question is, historically, ASEAN has seen significant initiatives that have often resulted from one of its members' efforts. So do you think ASEAN could provide sufficient mechanisms dealing with the health outbreaks without pioneering effort from one of the members itself? And the last question is from Sarah from RSIS. And she asks, as COVID-19 is likely to persist for a while, how can ASEAN maintain the level of confidence building activities in defense in place of F2F face-to-face meetings and joint exercises? So we have 6 questions. Maybe we'll first turn to Pak Frege to address those questions. Pak Frege?
All right. Thank you, Mas Ibrahim. Thank you for the question. I think I would like to address the first question by Sigit from RIS. Cooperation in the initial phase of COVID-19. As far as I know, because most countries actually are struggling with this COVID-19 pandemic, and in most of the recent articles that we know that it creates a tragic surprise, even for developed countries. They are struggling as well, like the European countries, even the U.S. So the early phase of COVID-19 pandemic, every country in the region tried to focus to deal with their domestic issues, as pointed out by I think by the other two speakers. But there has been numerous initiatives actually taken in terms of the defense cooperation, especially at the ministerial level, at the chief of defense forces level. Um, but because, as I pointed out in my presentation, that the limitation of face-to-face interaction, so we limit through personal connection, either virtual or by phone, and even the reason one we can witness the tabletop exercise, and even in the last ACMM retreat, when there was still an opportunity to interact face to face, there was a commitment from the strategic defense leaders to work together. And of course, even though Mas Yandri mentioned that pandemic is there, but the scale of this one is a bit different. I mean, from my perspective, as we may witness, even major power countries, even like China and the U.S., they are struggling. Even they are now facing a very complicated situation, as we may probably categorize as wicked problem. And the second question from Mas Abid from Science Po, lack of leadership. I think this resonates with the first question in terms of leadership, because as I know that most of the ASEAN leaders have committed, through virtual conference. I noticed that the President Widodo has communicated with other regional leaders as well. So the commitment is there. But the thing is, it's not only about the defense or securitization of issues, because it's very multidimensional. There are economic impacts. There are other non-security issues that should be tackled as well at the same time. And having limited resources, because it varies among other ASEAN countries. Let's say like Singapore is different with Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Even with the population that we have, even though maybe Singapore is small, but the cases in the beginning is very high. Indonesia with the largest population. So different contextualization of issues. Regarding leadership, at this stage, maybe I won't say it that way, but because of the complexity of the issues, the focus tends to be more domestic. But as the two other speakers mentioned, it is urgent that we have to propose a regional approach in order to help our region tackle with the issue, especially the commitment to share best practices. And then the third question from Harry from Korean Mission to ASEAN. Of course, to optimize ACMM, as we have witnessed commitment from the ASEAN countries, and also the commitment from the leaders, strategic defense leaders, we have also witnessed tabletop exercise. Of course, there's a greater opportunity for external partners, especially we have the platform for under the ADMM Plus, where external partners can actually chip in, and probably with the best, not necessarily best practices, but probably the lesson learned that maybe Korea or other external partners may offer to the table. That would be very good for other Asian countries to learn as well, because at this stage there's no silver bullet to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, but the initiative to merge the approach between ASEAN and external partners will be a very good solution at this stage. The fourth question to Marina from Habibie Center. I think I raised this out in my presentation. Alternative is a bit limited, but still you can optimize the virtual engagement at a strategic level, or probably direct communication links that may facilitate a greater interaction, either bilaterally or multilaterally between leaders. And operational level, we witnessed the tabletop exercise. Maybe this is currently organized under the ACMM, ASEAN Center for Military Medicine. Maybe it can be developed in, other aspects, probably in dealing with the civil military relations, as pointed out by Mas Yandri and Mas Arif regarding the civil military relations in tackling, this disease. Because I remember in 2010 or 2011, if I'm not mistaken, we have the ARF disaster relief exercise, which actually facilitates civil military relations collaboration in dealing with this disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. But maybe the scenario at the time was natural disaster. This could be enhanced by integrating like pandemic scenario, yeah, and of course, the issue between allocating this kind of discourse under the ADMM or other sector, is one of the challenge that we have to cope with as well. But the goodwill is there, and the opportunity is there. It's just how we need to calibrate or synchronize our effort to make a concrete action. And I think the last question from Sarah, RSIS, probably is a bit similar answer that I gave to Marina, the virtual tabletop exercise, and probably a good initiative if we can, maybe in the near future, we can develop augmented reality, virtual reality as part of the tactical scenario, virtual interaction between military units or military personnel could be an option as well. I think that's my answer to the 5 questions, because I noticed that Galbi specifically addressed his question to Mas Yandri. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. But Yandri, would you like to answer the question, especially the one from Galbi?
Okay, thank you. For more general question like why does ASEAN seems underperform? Why does ASEAN stutter during this COVID-19? Maybe my short answer would be, I don't know. But then my question also, who doesn't? So for example, United States as the sole global superpowers looks so goofy dealing with this problem. Bang Frega also from the Great Britain. Great Britain, for example, is very interesting. Used to colonialize 1/3 of the world, the ruler of 7 seas, and look how the Boris Johnson government dealing with this disease. Or maybe we can look at Germany and French. The leaders and paymasters of European Union, they also have a problem dealing with this situation. So for time being, maybe the safest answer would be like all international entity, international actors, a nation state or international organization, caught unprepared with this disease. But again, also I have more question than answer for this problem. But again, my question, like I quoted from literature what I found. For example, Western government launched initiative aimed at developing and testing national pandemic influenza contingency measures. Plans were developed using scenarios supported by epidemic modeling and clinical attack rates, often based on 1918 pandemic, to predict the extent of the projected human morbidity and mortality. Where this simulation has been gone. And also from 2005 to 2009, international community pledged more or less $4.3 billion to enhance global pandemic preparedness. And yet we return back to the very typical of realist perception on international relations. When a state need a help, when the state make a call when they need a help, there is no other entity in the end of the other line to answer the phone. So this is what we have here. So so that's why I have more problem. I mean, actually, since 1997 and the beginning of the 2000 early 2000, the world states international organization WHO have developed some scenarios, have developed some cooperation. They have some prediction how to deal with the outbreak of pandemic disease. But those stories, we don't see those stories during this situation. And then to the second question from Galbi, it depends. It depends how the ASEAN political leaders develop a commitment. But I think also within the ASEAN itself need to familiar more with the historical trajectory of ASEAN itself. When ASEAN was established in 1967, it was aimed to maintain political dynamic between Southeast Asian countries. And then several years after that, ASEAN tried to coordinate itself, the member state, how to deal with the great power rivalries in the region. We are talking about the Cold War era. And then when the Cold War ends, ASEAN, it appears to me, maybe I'm totally wrong, it appears to me the ASEAN state wasn't really prepared for the international system after the Cold War era. ASEAN is, so from the early 90s up to now, ASEAN still struggling to how to perceive itself and project itself in dealing with a new political security dynamic of the international system. So the initial idea of ASEAN was very simple. How Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Philippines not to have a problem to each other. That's simple. Yeah, back in 767, it was so simple. But it's getting complicated because of the Cold War situation, and then become more complicated because the source of the problem, not necessarily the state, but we have the non-traditional issues, and now we have this. But so if ASEAN leaders decide to have like leading states in developing this cooperation between defense and defense cooperation to deal with the natural disaster or pandemic disease, it's okay. But if ASEANs have to decided, if ASEAN political leaders decided will do this in the very totally different mechanism, it also totally okay. But it totally depends on the current situation how ASEAN member states can work together conveniently, because the situation today is really totally different from the Cold War era. But maybe we can look at the Cold War era in the 70s and the 90s. ASEAN member states at the time had quite success to make economic and development cooperation in economic and development sectors. For example, the urea industrial complex, pupuk urea in Pusri, pupuk Sriwijaya in Palembang. It was ASEAN project. Yeah, during Suharto era, it was an ASEAN project, and we also have like in Arun gas field. It was also ASEAN project, and maybe now the ASEAN leaders need to look back the trajectory of how to develop those cooperation and maybe make some application and modification how to apply it in the current situation. But one thing I am very sure about this defense cooperation to for pandemic disease and also at the same time for natural disaster. Nature and disease don't have sovereignty. Nature and disease don't have territory. Nature and disease don't have ideology. So we have ASEAN have mechanism to cooperate in dealing with issues in South China Sea. From time to time, from year to year, it's getting more complicated than before. ASEAN defense industry collaboration since 2011. It stayed where it was in 2011. And ASEAN also have a cooperation for the human peacekeeping operation. The idea is very liberal. The idea is very idealist. How to stop conflicts and humanitarian crisis. But to conduct peacekeeping operation is highly politically. It's so politically. It's very. I don't really think it's gonna be like Arif said it before. It's like low-hanging fruit for defense cooperation. But when it comes to the nature and disease, this problem don't have sovereignty, don't have territory, and don't have ideology. So it's very hard to move on the ASEAN industry collaboration. It's very hard to move on the South China Sea issues. It's very hard to move on the peacekeeping operation. Let's have something that we are good at it, and we don't deal with the problem. Is not from the other state. Yeah. So I think this is a very good opportunity to look ASEAN cooperation and defense cooperation from different perspectives. And then we can start developing like a war gaming scenario to deal with the pandemic and also natural disaster. And then we will talking about how to deal with disease. We're not talking about the violation of sovereignty. We are not talking, in times we will get to a situation where it's okay when to cross the one state's territory to help people from the volcano eruption, or to help people to evacuate people from the disease epicenter, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Muhammad Arif, for the last final comments.
Yeah, I think I'll try to add some to some of the questions. When it comes to the underperformance of ASEAN, I think actually ASEAN the start was quite good, right? I mean the meeting of ASEAN Center for Military Medicine that was mentioned before was organized in late January. It's even way before Indonesia had its first discovered cases. And then in February, there was a specific meeting at the ministerial level that specifically talked about COVID-19, defense ministers meeting. So the start was quite good, but then it just that my talk is the context of my talk is the security cooperation, defense cooperation in ASEAN. So when I say it's underperforming is the security cooperation in dealing with COVID-19 that is underperforming. So the start was good, but then it just that the modalities are not there for defense cooperation in ASEAN to really do much to deal with with COVID. As we discussed before, largely infectious disease emerging and re-emerging disease in ASEAN still fall under the purview of the ASEAN sociocultural community, and you have this barriers for cross-sectoral works in some are loose, but then in some areas you still need to work on that. And when I say robust, it's specifically the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief infrastructure that is robust in ASEAN, and there's an infrastructure that security cooperation, I would say, could leverage in dealing with COVID-19. By default, HADR is not. I mean, there is a working group on HADR in ADMM plus, but then it mostly deals with natural disaster. The discussion is really within the context or within the themes of natural disaster. It's not really prepared for crisis caused by diseases like this. So that's within the context of security cooperation. If we want to try to talk about ASEAN in general and how it responds to COVID-19, yeah, again, I mean the claim that it's underperforming, I think is justified, right? You have the so-called COVID-19 fund, which some say is a positive development. It is a positive development, but again, you also had a fund after SARS in 2003, and mostly it's still a reactionary kind of approach. It's not something that we still talk about sharing experience, sharing best practices. There is a study conducted to study securitization of disease in the European Union, and one of the observations was that sharing best practices was found in the early phases of cooperation in EU back in 1990s. So now, I mean, the infrastructure at the level of EU, I think, is quite mature when it comes to health security. But the cooperation in sharing best practices and all that, it was way back in 1990s when EU started talking about having a supranational original infrastructure in dealing with health security. So we still have a long way to go for example, to have a so-called the early warning system to deal with future emerging diseases. On leadership, I think it is not something that is. I think that the thing about COVID-19 is that it's a transnational issues, and we kind of expected that. And I think this is when we talk about transnational issues, we always talk about how it crosses boundaries. It can affect any country, and supposedly states would have more incentive to work together, right, to cooperate with each other. The thing about COVID-19 is it is a transnational issue, but the response is very realpolitik, right? So the countries are becoming more exclusive. Countries are becoming more selfish. Countries who have dealt with their own problems, try to. Countries are trying to gain strategic advantage from this particular condition. And in the context of ASEAN, I don't think there is any country that is really well prepared to take up the leadership role when it comes to COVID-19, given how we were kind of busy dealing with the problems in our own countries. And also, I think it has something to do with how the ASEAN decision making is structured. Sometimes you know how ASEAN works, right? The chair have a lot to say when it comes to determining the agenda in a particular year, and you have also focal points or a country that is in charge for each of these initiatives, and that particular country sometimes have a lot to say in determining the agenda of that particular forum. And sometimes that particular member states that are in charge of these forums are not really prepared, or in terms of resources available to to take up the leadership in this case in dealing with COVID-19. To Sarah, I think I don't have anything to add with the answer. Yeah, Pak Frega talk about the virtual meetings, virtual tabletop exercises, and augmented reality, and so on and so forth. But I want to say what I want to say is that what I want to underline is that the potential impacts of of COVID-19 on confidence building agenda in the region. I mean, this is the time that I think this is a time when confidence and trust is we really need it at most, and when you don't have forums and you cannot meet face to face, I think that would severely damage the the agenda to build trust and confidence in this region, not only in Southeast Asia but also in the Asia Pacific at large. And secondly, I think it would quite severely damage not really. It would negatively impact the military readiness and preparedness of defense forces in the region. How some of the ASEAN member states are still rely on their interaction with their external partners in terms of exercises and combat readiness and all that. Now that they cannot conduct exercise, and I think that could in the long term affect the readiness of the defense forces in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arif. So we've now reached the end of our Talking ASEAN public webinar. So I'd like to thank our three speakers, Pak Frega, Yandri, and also to Arif for providing us with a very fruitful discussion this afternoon. And I won't try to conclude or provide any conclusions, but we will be having a discussion report and also sharing the PowerPoint later on. So please, if you haven't, do feel free to make sure that you've registered online. And also, I would be amiss to not thank our audience as well for providing our speakers with very, very interesting questions for them to address. So once again, thank you so much to our three speakers, and we look forward to seeing you at our next public webinar. So thank you so much, and please stay safe and stay healthy wherever you may be. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.